The Great War was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. But for one man, the battle had just begun. In a quiet office far from the trenches of France, a retired U.S. Army officer named John Taliaferro Thompson stared at a sketch on his desk, a machine that could change the face of combat. He wasn't an arms dealer. He wasn't a gangster. He was an idealist, a man who believed technology could save lives by ending stalemates faster. Thompson's dream was simple: a trench broom. A compact, fully automatic weapon soldiers could carry through no man's land, sweeping away enemy forces in seconds. He believed that speed, not size, would define the wars of the future. By late 1918, his design was nearly ready. A short, stocky firearm with a drum magazine and a wooden grip. It fired .45 caliber rounds, pistol ammunition, but at a shocking rate of 800 shots per minute. It was small, efficient, and terrifyingly fast. He called it the Annihilator. Later, it would earn a more famous name, the Thompson Submachine Gun. But Thompson was too late. By the time his weapon was ready for production, the war had ended. The armistice was signed. Factories that had been roaring for 4 years went silent overnight. The army, now demobilizing millions of soldiers, wasn't looking for a new weapon. They were cutting budgets, not building arsenals. And so, Thompson's masterpiece, his dream of a weapon to save lives through superior firepower, found no home. The Auto Ordnance Corporation, founded to produce his new gun, was left with thousands of unsold units, stacked in warehouses, crated, forgotten. The weapon of the future had no war to fight. For General Thompson, it was a bitter irony. He had spent his life in service of his country, only to watch his greatest invention gather dust. To the military, it was unnecessary. To the world, it was invisible. But history was already setting the stage for its rebirth, in a far darker theater. Because as America celebrated peace, another kind of war was brewing at home. A war not fought by nations, but by men in suits and fedoras. The 18th Amendment went into effect. Prohibition became the law of the land. Alcohol, once legal and everywhere, was suddenly contraband. In every major city, a new gold rush began. Brewers, distillers, smugglers, and gangsters saw an opportunity. Booze was money, and money was power. In Chicago, Detroit, New York, criminal empires began to rise overnight. The first bootleggers smuggled liquor in cars and crates, bribing cops and politicians to look the other way. But as profits grew, so did ambition. Competition turned to conflict, rackets turned into territories, and when territory was at stake, blood followed. At first, the killings were clumsy. Shotguns, revolvers, quick ambushes in alleys or outside speakeasies. But soon, the gangs wanted something faster, something that could clear an entire street in seconds. And in a locked warehouse in Cleveland, the answer was waiting. The Thompson Submachine Gun, designed for soldiers, was about to find its first army. By 1921, Auto Ordnance finally decided to sell to the public. If the military didn't want the gun, maybe police departments or private security companies would. It was marketed as the anti-bandit gun. Ironically, the slogan that was meant to sell it to law enforcement would attract exactly the kind of men it was designed to stop. Each unit sold for around $200, a fortune at the time but a small price for immortality. Soon, cases of Tommy guns began moving quietly through back channels. Some went to ranchers, some to private guards, and a few to names that would one day become legends. By 1922, the gun had reached Chicago, a city already cracking under the pressure of prohibition, police corruption, gang rivalries, and the endless flow of illegal liquor. The Irish mob, the Italians, the North Side Gang, each fighting not for ideals, but for control. The first time the Tommy gun was fired in anger, it wasn't on a battlefield in Europe. It was on a street in Chicago, and the world would never be the same again. Witnesses described it like thunder, a mechanical roar, short and sharp, like a typewriter gone mad. The muzzle flash tore through the night, Car windows exploded. Men dove for cover. It was over in seconds. Dozens of bullets. One gunman. And an entire city suddenly realized that the rules of street warfare had changed forever. The newspapers called it the Chicago Typewriter. It was fast, loud, and lethal, the perfect symbol for a new kind of criminal empire. A gun designed for the trenches now ruled the streets. John Thompson never intended this. He wanted his invention to save soldiers' lives, not end civilian ones. But invention has no conscience, only purpose. And in the hands of men like Johnny Torrio and Al Capone, the Tommy gun found its purpose. A weapon of war, reborn in the heart of America. By the early 1920s, its reputation had already spread. To the gangs it was power, to the police it was terror, and to the public it was the sound of a nation losing control. The Tommy gun had failed as a military weapon, but succeeded as something far greater. It gave rise to the first modern crime empire, and it would turn Chicago into a war zone. The gun America didn't want had just built the empire it couldn't stop. It began quietly, a few boxes shipped under vague invoices, a few dealers looking to make a fast buck. No one in the auto ordnance office could have guessed that their forgotten weapon, the one the Army didn't want, was about to rewrite the rules of American crime. The first Tommy guns that arrived in Chicago didn't go straight into gangsters' hands. They were purchased by security companies, small-town police chiefs, and private collectors. But in Prohibition America, everything, and everyone, had a price. Before long, those same guns were being resold in alleyway deals, traded between bootleggers, and slipped into the trunks of Model T Fords. To the underworld, it was love at first burst. A single man armed with a Tommy gun could outshoot an entire squad of rivals. The 50-round drum meant no reloading under pressure. The 45 caliber bullets could rip through cars, doors, and bodies alike. It didn't just kill, it dominated. Chicago became the weapons testing ground. The city was a powder keg. Corrupt officials, overwhelmed police, and ambitious gangsters clawing for control of the illegal liquor trade. The law said alcohol was banned, but the streets said otherwise. Every speakeasy was a fortress, every truck shipment a battlefield, and every gang needed muscle. Enter Johnny Torrio, calm, calculating, patient. He wasn't the kind of gangster who craved attention. He wanted order, structure, and for that, he needed a weapon that could impose it. When Torrio first saw the Thompson, he saw more than firepower. He saw balance. With one gun, he could silence rivals, intimidate police, and protect shipments without endless skirmishes. Violence could be clean, efficient, decisive. The Tommy gun was more than a tool. It was leverage. But Torrio was not the man who made it famous. That honor would belong to his young protege, a brash, ambitious newcomer named Al Capone. Capone saw what Torrio didn't care to admit. The Tommy gun wasn't just a weapon. It was theater. It was a statement. A way to make your enemies, and the public, remember your name. And in the Roaring '20s, image was everything. By 1923, Chicago's streets echoed with the staccato chatter of automatic fire. Gang wars became newsreels. Civilians stopped at the sight of black sedans idling near curbs. Windows shattered, tires screamed, and before anyone could react, silence. Police were hopelessly outgunned. Their 6-shot revolvers might as well have been toys. Reports of machine gun ambushes filled the headlines. The papers didn't call it murder anymore. They called it Chicago style. Each burst of gunfire was a punctuation mark in the city's new language of fear. But behind the chaos, Torrio stayed calm. He wasn't interested in spectacle. He was building something bigger, a network, a system. While Capone handled the dirty work, Torrio handled the logistics, importing Canadian whiskey, bribing officials, coordinating deals with other syndicates. To Torrio, violence was a means to an end. To Capone, it was part of the brand. And the Thompson Submachine Gun became their shared symbol, the perfect balance of business and brutality. By 1924, the Tommy gun was everywhere: New York, Detroit, Kansas City. Each city had its own bootleg wars, and each wanted the same edge: auto ordnance, struggling to stay afloat, didn't ask too many questions. A sale was a sale. Ironically, the company's marketing campaign still portrayed the Thompson as a lawman's friend. Full-page ads in magazines called it the anti-bandit gun and the law's equalizer. But in every police department that bought one, there were 5 gangsters who already had 10. The gun had switched sides, and the public knew it. Ordinary Americans began to associate the Tommy gun not with soldiers or heroes, but with men in pinstripe suits stepping out of Packards, grinning as they sprayed bullets across parking lots. Hollywood would later romanticize it, but in 1924, it was just fear. Raw, mechanical fear. Every time it barked, someone died. Every time it fired, the underworld grew stronger. Yet amid all the violence, John T. Thompson himself remained a ghost. The man who created the gun was horrified by what it had become. He watched from the sidelines as his trench broom turned into the instrument of America's first organized crime war. He had wanted to arm patriots, and instead, he'd armed killers. But there was no going back. Once unleashed, the Thompson had found its audience. For the gangsters of the Prohibition-era, it wasn't just a weapon. It was identity. A code. A way of saying, we own this city. And in Chicago, one man was about to prove that more brutally than anyone else. In 1925, after a rival gang tried and failed to take Johnny Torrio's life, the old kingmaker finally stepped aside. The throne passed to Capone. And with it, the Tommy gun ascended from weapon to icon. Now, it wasn't just part of the story. It was the story. Chicago's gang wars had become open combat. Drive-bys replaced diplomacy. Street corners became trenches. And the Tommy gun, that failed army gun, became the soundtrack of a city tearing itself apart. The gun that the U.S. military rejected had finally found its war. Not in Europe, but in America's own backyard. 1925. The streets of Chicago were no longer just streets. They were battlefields. And at the center of the storm stood a man whose name alone made others flinch. Alphonse, Al Capone. Capone had inherited more than an empire from Johnny Torrio. He inherited the weapon that defined it. The Thompson Submachine Gun, now nicknamed the Chicago Typewriter, was his voice, and Capone knew how to make it speak. Where Torrio had been methodical, Capone was theatrical. Where Torrio saw efficiency, Capone saw power projected, visible, undeniable. Every burst of the Tommy gun sent a message. This city belongs to us. By 1926, Capone controlled the majority of Chicago's lucrative bootlegging routes. Whiskey and beer flowed through secret warehouses, bribed policemen turned blind eyes, and rival gangs either bowed or bled. But the North Side Gang, led by Dean O'Banion and later George Bugs Moran, refused to yield. Torrio's vision of structure had been tested. Capone's style demanded escalation. Violence became ritualized. Drive-bys were now the standard tactic. Cars loaded with guns rolled slowly past rival hangouts. A sudden rattle of automatic fire echoed off brick walls. Windows shattered. Men fell. Screams pierced the night. And then, silence. The Tommy gun was central to this new theater of war. Its firepower could mow down entire crowds. Its rapid bursts, like a maniacal typewriter, left no room for hesitation. Police arrived too late. Witnesses fled. Bodies were counted later, if at all. Capone's genius was not just in firing the gun. It was in psychology. The Thompson-inspired terror. It was a musical instrument of intimidation. A man could walk into a speakeasy, drum a few rounds into the ceiling, and watch loyalty cement itself. And Chicago responded with headlines that fascinated and horrified in equal measure. "Machine gun slays 7 in Lincoln Park ambush," read one front page. "Capone's men strike again. Streets run red," screamed another. The public called it gangster warfare, but those in the underworld simply called it business. And the Tommy gun was their currency. The pinnacle of this era of terror came on February 14, 1929. The date would be etched into history as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 members of the North Side gang were lined up against a brick wall in a Lincoln Park garage. 2 men disguised as police officers entered the room. Tommy guns barked. Bullets tore through jackets, hats, and flesh. 7 men fell in seconds. The city gasped. No one was ever convicted. Capone's fingerprints were invisible, but the message was unmistakable. Capone ruled. Chicago trembled. The Tommy gun, once rejected by the army, had become the ultimate enforcer. It didn't need fame, just skillful hands. And in the hands of Capone, it became art. Deadly, precise, theatrical. Yet the violence was not without consequence. Public outrage grew. Police departments began militarizing. Congress launched hearings into organized crime. Every city official felt the pressure. And still, Capone thrived. Behind the headlines, Torrio watched quietly from the sidelines. He had taught Capone the lessons of organization, strategy, and restraint. But Capone had adapted those lessons into something far more visible. The machine gun became the bridge between Torrio's methodical empire and Capone's reign of fear. Chicago itself transformed under the shadow of the Tommy gun. Businesses paid protection money. Civilians learned to avoid certain streets after dark. Courts struggled to prosecute when witnesses were too terrified to testify. The gun did not just kill, it rewrote the rules of the city. And Capone's empire thrived because of it. The Thompson had limitations: jamming, misfires, heavy drums. But in Chicago, those flaws were invisible. Men carried extra magazines. They practiced in back alleys. And they adapted their tactics to exploit the gun's strengths. Every violent encounter became a lesson. Every rival defeated added to a growing mythology. The Tommy gun was no longer just a weapon, it was a legend. By 1930, Chicago had become synonymous with gangster violence. The city's skyline glittered with the illusion of normalcy. But behind every facade, fear thrummed. Capone's men were everywhere, and the Thompson was everywhere they needed it to be. The machine gun had become a kingmaker. It elevated men like Capone from mere criminals to rulers of a hidden empire. It enforced loyalty, demanded respect, and cemented power in ways that intimidation alone never could. And yet, for all its notoriety, the Tommy gun remained a simple truth. A weapon designed to save lives in the trenches of Europe had instead built one of the deadliest empires on American soil. It had failed in the war it was meant to fight, but succeeded spectacularly in the war it found at home. Chicago had changed forever, and so had the world's understanding of modern crime. The streets would never forget the sound of that machine: rapid, mechanical, unstoppable. It was a symphony of death. It was the heartbeat of the Mafia, and it had only just begun. 1929. Chicago's streets had become a battlefield. Bodies littered alleyways. Speakeasies were fortresses. The roar of the Tommy gun echoed nightly. And yet, for all the terror, the city's lawmen had begun to fight back. The nation had grown tired of reading headlines. 7 men lined up against a garage wall. A dozen shot in a drive-by. Public outrage demanded action. And Congress responded with legislation targeting organized crime like never before. The FBI, still in its infancy, began assembling dossiers. Special agents, dressed in suits and armed with standard-issue revolvers, were sent into Chicago's inferno of gang wars. But revolvers were useless against the typewriter. Every raid ended with bullets tearing through doors, walls, and the air itself. Local police tried to adapt. Tommy guns, shotguns, and armored cars were introduced. But the Mafia was already ahead. Capone and his lieutenants had perfected the art of terror, and the gun had become their signature. Congress demanded hearings. Capone's empire was now under a microscope, yet he never fired a shot in court. He smiled for the cameras, played the public like a fiddle, and let the machine do the talking. Every burst of the Tommy gun had already cemented his reputation. Courts and juries were powerless against fear. Meanwhile, Torrio, now retired and living quietly in New York, watched from the shadows. He had built the structure. Capone had added flair. And now the law was closing in. Public opinion had begun to turn. Films and newspapers sensationalized the carnage. The Tommy gun became a cultural symbol, terrifying yet fascinating. Children whispered about the Chicago Typewriter in schoolyards, gangsters bragged about it in bars, and Capone's enemies learned to respect it. By 1930, federal authorities realized that pursuing Capone directly was nearly impossible. Witnesses were afraid, evidence disappeared. The man himself never touched a gun in public, but the Tommy gun left a trail impossible to ignore. Then came the strategy that would finally corner the king of Chicago: financial crimes. Capone's empire depended on revenue streams, bootlegging, gambling, and bribery. If the government could follow the money, they could cut the empire from the inside. The weapon that had made him untouchable in the streets could not protect him from accountants and ledgers. But in the meantime, the streets remained his. Drive-bys continued, enemies continued to fall, and the Tommy gun continued its reign. Public fascination grew. Gangsters became anti-heroes in the eyes of some. Capone's charisma, combined with the roar of the machine gun, created a legend. Yet fear lingered beneath every smile, every headline, every photograph. By 1931, federal pressure intensified. Capone was indicted for tax evasion. Prohibition agents and the IRS worked together, a new kind of law enforcement challenge. They couldn't stop the bullets, but they could follow the dollars. And in this chess game, Capone's weapons were silent. Even as raids and arrests escalated, the streets spoke a language only the typewriter could translate. Every gang that opposed him learned quickly. Diplomacy failed, negotiations failed, bullets succeeded. The Tommy gun was proof of principle. The fastest way to power was terror, delivered with precision. Yet, ironically, the gun's very effectiveness also drew attention. Every explosion of fire, every body counted in the press, built the case for national intervention. Capone's audacity and the machine gun's lethality had created enemies in every branch of law. Chicago itself became a laboratory of modern crime and law enforcement. Armored vehicles, surveillance, wiretaps, innovations born out of necessity to counter the machine gun's reign. And while Capone fought battles in alleys, federal agents fought battles in offices, courts, and ledgers. By 1933, Capone's empire was strained. Prohibition was ending. Revenue streams were drying. And yet, even as his influence began to wane, the legend of the Tommy gun remained. It had defined an era. It had shaped public consciousness. It had created a gangster mythos that would endure for generations. For Torrio, the retired architect of the empire, it was validation of his vision. Structure, strategy, and innovation could survive even the wildest violence. For Capone, the typewriter had been a tool of power, theater, and terror, the ultimate weapon of his reign. The streets of Chicago would never forget the sound, the sharp staccato bark of the Tommy gun echoing against brick, steel, and asphalt. It had built empires. It had toppled rivals. And it had forced the nation to confront a new kind of war, one not fought in Europe but in America's own cities. By the end of this chapter, the story is clear. The gun America rejected had become the symbol of criminal ingenuity, terror, and enduring legend. It was more than a weapon. It was the voice of the Mafia itself. The bullets had stopped. The streets of Chicago, though still dangerous, were quieter. Prohibition was ending. Capone was behind bars, convicted not for murder, not for machine guns, but for tax evasion. Yet the legend of the Tommy gun, the Chicago typewriter, lived on. Hollywood noticed. Filmmakers, always hungry for spectacle, saw in the Tommy gun a perfect symbol. Speed, power, fear, and glamour rolled into one weapon. Gangster movies exploded onto screens across the nation. The Thompson was everywhere, in dark alleys on cinema reels, in sepia-toned posters, and in the imaginations of millions of Americans. In 1932, Scarface hit theaters. Al Capone's life, though altered for fiction, was unmistakable. And the weapon he had made famous? The Tommy gun was the star. Actors mimicked its rapid-fire staccato. Scenes of ambushes, drive-bys, and shootouts thrilled audiences who had never held a gun, let alone seen one in real life. The cultural shift was remarkable. A weapon designed for war, rejected by the army, had gone from instrument of terror to icon of entertainment. Young men in high school imagined themselves as Capone, wielding the typewriter, controlling streets they'd never walk. Children whispered, "machine gun" in playgrounds, unaware of the bloodshed behind the sound. And gangsters themselves, even decades later, understood its power not just physically but psychologically. Even outside Chicago, the influence spread. New York, Los Angeles, Miami, cities struggling with their own crime waves, looked to Chicago as both cautionary tale and blueprint. The Thompson was the template. A gangster with a machine gun was no longer an anomaly. He was the standard. Organized crime learned from Chicago: structure, intimidation, and the perfect tool to enforce both. Behind the cameras, the filmmakers marveled at the weapon's theatricality. Bullets could spray like confetti. The firepower was cinematic before the first reel was shot. And for audiences, the visual poetry of violence, brief, rapid, and shocking, captured the essence of modern crime. Yet for real-life lawmen and survivors of gang wars, the Tommy gun remained terrifyingly real. Stories circulated of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, of rival gangs decimated, of streets silenced by fear. And still, despite decades passing, the gun carried its reputation. Meanwhile, the Mafia adapted. With Capone imprisoned, the next generation of mobsters studied not just his methods, but the symbolism he had built. The Tommy gun was more than a weapon. It was a legacy, a psychological tool, a mark of authority. New crime families used it sparingly, understanding that spectacle could enforce obedience even more than raw violence. For John T. Thompson, the inventor, the transformation was bittersweet. His gun, intended to save lives in war, had rewritten the rules of civilian power. It had elevated gangsters into legends. It had turned fear into currency. Yet its ingenuity could not be denied. By the 1940s and 1950s, the Tommy gun's role in actual crime began to fade. Police forces became better armed, and laws regulating automatic weapons grew stricter. But in film, in magazines, and in public imagination, it was immortal. It was a symbol of an era, the Roaring Twenties, the gangster wars, and Chicago's reign of terror. The typewriter became a character in its own right. Directors instructed actors not just how to point it, but how to move with it, how to make it sing. Audiences felt the tension of every rapid-fire burst, whether in theaters or in serialized pulp fiction. In the end, the Tommy gun's greatest achievement was not measured in deaths or destruction, but in legend. It had transformed from a failed military tool into a cultural icon. It had defined the rise of the modern American gangster. And it had ensured that the story of Chicago's Prohibition-era would never be forgotten. Even decades later, collectors, historians, and filmmakers study the weapon. Its mechanics, its history, its power, all remain a testament to what can happen when innovation meets ambition, and when a single invention falls into the hands of those who see opportunity in chaos. The streets had learned their lesson. The cameras had immortalized it, and the world had never seen a weapon like it before, nor would it likely see another. The Tommy gun, once a military experiment, rejected and forgotten, had become a symbol of terror, power, and legend. It had built empires. It had toppled rivals. It had changed Chicago forever. And in the quiet of empty warehouses and Hollywood backlots, it still whispered the story of the city that fear built, and the empire that followed. The streets of Chicago had long since quieted. Prohibition was over. Capone was gone. And yet, the echo of the Tommy gun lingered, like a ghost in the city's memory. By the 1950s, the Thompson Submachine Gun had largely disappeared from the hands of gangsters. Law enforcement had caught up. Automatic weapons were regulated. Cities no longer trembled at the rattle of a 50-round drum. But the weapon's legend was indelible. It had transformed from a failed army experiment into a symbol of power and fear. It had built empires where bullets enforced loyalty and spectacle became strategy. And in every corner of America, young men dreamed of wielding it, even if only in imagination or on the silver screen. Hollywood continued to romanticize the machine gun. Films like The Untouchables and later crime dramas trace their roots to Chicago's streets, to the typewriter's rhythm, to the era of rapid-fire violence that had captivated the public. Directors, writers, and actors studied its history, imbuing each cinematic burst with the mythology of the gangster who had made it famous. In film, the Tommy gun became more than a weapon. It was a character, a mood, a heartbeat. Meanwhile, the Mafia evolved. Organized crime no longer relied solely on spectacle or automatic fire. They learned the lesson Torrio had taught decades earlier: structure, patience, discretion. Power could be maintained quietly, without daily gunfights, without headline-making massacres. The typewriter had shown them that fear could be manufactured, amplified, and wielded efficiently. Lessons that persisted even as the gun itself vanished from the streets. Collectors and historians preserved examples of the Thompson, studying its mechanics and its place in history. Books and documentaries chronicled the rise of Chicago's gangs, emphasizing how a rejected military weapon had altered the balance of power. Its impact was clear. One invention, in the right hands, could reshape society, law enforcement, and culture itself. Across the country, museum exhibits displayed the weapon as both artifact and symbol. Visitors stared at the steel, the drum, the barrel that had once roared in alleyways. Many marveled at its design, many shivered at its legacy. The Thompson Submachine Gun also taught a different kind of lesson: that innovation, ambition, and opportunity could converge in unexpected ways. The Army had rejected it. The military had moved on. But in the underworld, in the hands of Torrio, Capone, and countless others, it became unstoppable. It had been repurposed, reimagined, and immortalized. By the late 20th century, the Tommy gun's direct influence on crime had waned, but its mythology had entered the cultural bloodstream. Video games, comic books, and modern cinema referenced the weapon and the era it had defined. Chicago's Prohibition history became shorthand for the rise of organized crime, and the typewriter, more than any person, symbolized the transformation of violence into strategy and spectacle. Even as decades passed, historians noted a singular truth: the Thompson Submachine Gun had reshaped the way Americans understood both crime and power. It had taught that terror could be wielded as effectively as money, that structure could amplify brutality, and that one tool, when combined with vision and ambition, could leave a legacy lasting generations. The streets of Chicago never forgot. The skyline, the warehouses, the abandoned speakeasies, all whispered echoes of rapid-fire bursts that had once ruled them. And while modern law enforcement had moved past automatic weapons and public drive-bys, the mythology of the typewriter endured. For John T. Thompson, the man who had created it, the story was bittersweet. He had intended a weapon to save lives. Instead, he had inadvertently provided the blueprint for modern organized crime. And yet, in his invention's ingenuity, in its mechanical perfection, he could see the unintended genius that had changed history. The Mafia, too, remembered. Even as gunfights faded, the lessons remained: fear, visibility, intimidation, and planning. The Tommy gun had been the ultimate enforcer, but the empire that grew from it proved that brains, strategy, and organization outlasted bullets. By the 21st century, the Thompson Submachine Gun had entered the realm of legend. It was no longer feared on streets, but revered in culture. Collectors, historians, and storytellers continued to study it, marveling at how a rejected piece of military hardware had terrorized a city, built an empire, and forever changed America's understanding of crime. And so the legacy remained: a failed army gun, a criminal empire, a city's nightmare, a legend immortalized on film, in books, and in the echoes of history. The story of the Tommy gun and Chicago's gangsters reminds us that power does not always follow the rules it was designed for. Sometimes, it emerges in the hands of those who see opportunity where others see failure. And sometimes history is written, not with pens or speeches, but with rapid-fire bursts from a steel barrel.